Hi everyone, good day or good evening, depending on from where you are connected today. Welcome to our discussion on domestic workers' struggles shaking the foundations of the global economy, organized by a working group of 7 different offices of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in different parts of the world. My name is Alex Wisniewski and I'm the coordinator of the Global Feminism Program of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. The objective of this program is to strengthen transnational exchange and coordination in order to be able to address the global challenges of today. Because even if those global challenges have different national characteristics, the answers we give must be global as well. One of the most pressing of these issues is the crisis of care and social reproduction, which results, among other things, from the fact that caring for oneself and others does not yield any direct profit and therefore does not attract attention or support in a capitalist system. At the same time, care work is the one work that never stops and that constitutes a fundamental pillar of the contemporary global economy as it makes all other work possible. This was only highlighted once again by the COVID-19 pandemic. In the context of a lack of proper public infrastructure, there tend to be 2 foundations for care provision. Unpaid care labor primarily carried out by women in households and where personal economic resources allow it or social standards dictate it in the form of paid household employment. According to the global and regional estimates by the ILO, there are 67.1 million people over the age of 15 whose main employment is domestic work. This number represents close to 2% of the waged labor force in the whole world. However, since household employment is a sector that continues to be trapped in informality to a large degree, the effective number could be close to an estimate of 100 million workers around the world. The extent of this economic sector is also linked to the steady supply of cheap labor that is possible through an increasing precarity and vulnerability along the axis of race, class, and gender. The sector of domestic work is strongly connected to the devaluation of feminized care work, as well as to colonial legacies and racism. It is estimated that 1 of every 25 employed women in the world is a domestic worker, and that household employment makes about 8% of the total work that migrant persons are engaged in. This entanglement of power relations results in the hyper-exploitation of domestic workers all around the world, although in different forms and intensities. On the other hand, domestic workers face enormous obstacles to fighting for their rights, given the characteristics of the work itself, which is carried out informally in a private household, presenting challenges to union and political organizing as they are traditionally understood. That is why the adoption of the ILO Convention 189 in June 2011 was a long and hard-fought struggle and a great success for domestic workers. For the first time, they were recognized as workers and granted basic labor rights. However, 10 years after its adoption, many problems remain unresolved. Therefore, as Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, we wanted to take the anniversary of the convention as an opportunity to ask about the implementation gaps, as well as the necessities and demands that are going beyond the convention in the first place, like, for example, migration regimes. Moreover, since the convention is also the result of the struggles of domestic workers, the moment is right to ask as well about the ongoing organizing process, its potential and its challenges today. You can find different perspectives and regional analyses around those questions in our online dossier, Beyond Convention 189, which is published on the English website of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And in this same context, I'm very happy to be able to present to you our panel today and to engage in a personal exchange on the realities and the struggles on the ground with 3 different activists. We have planned around an hour of discussion with our 3 panelists and will then open for questions from you. Please put them in the comment section and we'll pick them up and as many as possible. So as our first speaker, I want to welcome Maya John. Maya is a labor historian, and she is teaching in the University of Delhi in India and convener of Karelu Kaunga Union, a domestic workers' union. Maya, you also wrote a very interesting article for the dossier in which you argue for municipalization of domestic work. Could you explain that, what you would mean with it, and in relation to which regional analysis you're making this claim? But now I just don't see Maya. So we are hoping she's joining us again. And I'm just giving the word to our next guest, Deborah Carlos Valencia from Greece. Deborah is emigrated from the Philippines to Greece in 1985. She has many experiences in community organizing and empowering migrant women as a co-founder of various organizations in Europe, most recently Melissa, the Network of Migrant Women in Greece, an organization bringing together migrant and refugee women and promoting their empowerment. Deborah, you're mainly working exactly at the junction of domestic work and migration. What's the reality of migrant domestic workers in Greece, and what needs to be changed on a legal level? And for us, and also in the context of the dossier, it would be also very interesting to hear about how the Convention 189 plays a role in the struggles of migrant women, migrant domestic workers in Greece. So, please.
Thank you, Alex. So, hi to all. It's good to be here and to hear, your experiences on the ground. So, here in Greece, the work of migrant domestic workers takes place in the private households and a place which is often exempt from labor laws and where typically labor unions have no access. Migrant domestic workers are often exploited by the families they work with. For for many, they face psychological, physical, sexual, and racist harassments from their employers and the children of their employers. Their work includes child care, elderly care, cleaning, cooking, laundry, and many others as demanded by their employers. In many cases, working conditions in the private household lead to violations of labor and fundamental human rights of domestic workers, both in the situations of their immigration status and labor conditions, which do not recognize domestic work as proper work or a category for immigration. It's still mainly categorized as unskilled. And in this context, the worker is faced with an unsustainable status as a worker and frequently becomes undocumented. So, work in the private home is highly unregulated and it is open to abuse and violation of labor and basic human rights. Moreover, working in the private household also posed as a deterrent or obstacle in joining self-organized associations. They work in isolation with long hours and limited mobility. So it's always a challenge to engage migrant domestic workers in mobilizing and organizing. What are our recommendations? Our number one recommendation is the recognition of domestic work as proper work and the inclusion of migrant domestic workers as an integral part of the workforce with an immigration status that recognizes migrant domestic workers. Second, a comprehensive legal protection labor legislation that applies to all other workers, and to ensure equal protection under the law. Fourth is effective protection of domestic workers in the employment of diplomatic corps or diplomatic mission, and they should be able to access legal redress in the case of unjust and abusive treatment. As we all know, that diplomatic corps personnel are enjoying diplomatic immunity, and in many cases they are able to get away with the abuses that they have, extended to domestic workers. So there should be special attention that to be given for domestic workers working with diplomatic corps. And then the fifth one is to provide provisions to protect domestic workers against physical, sexual, and psychological violence. A mechanism where they could access immediate and confidential legal redress and support. And the last one is enabling migrant domestic workers or any domestic workers to be able to join labor unions and other social movements to amplify the voice of domestic workers and to promote their rights, and welfare. So these are mainly the issues that our domestic workers are facing here in Greece, and our recommendations, as you know, as has been discussed repeatedly during our gatherings and meetings. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Deborah. I think you already mentioned several things that we are also will take up in a later moment of today's discussion. And I think also many things that Maya John also mentioned in her article. And I hear Maya is back with us, so I would love to give the word to you now. I don't know if you heard my question before, but you also wrote a very interesting text for the dossier of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, where you explain, where you argue for a municipalization of domestic work and a firm role of the state. And I would like to ask you to explain this claim a little bit, and in which regional context you were making it.
First of all, thank you for organizing this, and it is an honor to be part of a panel along with my fellow activists from Greece and from other parts of the world. I represent India and, broadly speaking, the South Asian region, and I'm speaking from this region, the experiences stemming from this part of the world. Now, South Asian, specifically the country India, to which I belong, is characterized by a generalized trend, which I want to emphasize before I go into the kind of demands and needs which are emerging. Now, here, the majority of women in the workforce are actually concentrated in the lowest rungs of the labor market. In India specifically, paid domestic work is the third largest industry or sector to actually employ women's labor. And, agriculture and construction are two big industries, followed by domestic work. So the numbers of women involved, and in fact, even children in paid domestic work is huge. It's very large numbers. Now comes the question of the peculiarities of the workplace and the kind of work process that we find in Indian homes, Indian households, or across South Asia, where you have households employing these women for paid domestic work. Now we find that typically, the domestic worker, as even mentioned by the speaker before me, they're entering into another person's home, and it's the employer's home which constitutes as the workplace, and so it is a domain of work ultimately domestic work is a domain of work that is highly individuated, very personalized, and heavily governed by the private power, the private regulation of employers. And here in India, most of them are women employers. Now, the first and foremost problem, is that nobody knows the exact number of domestic workers in India, and we have very little, record across South Asia, the actual number of the workforce. Um, Now, when people are going to work outside, in fields, in construction sites, in factories, in workshops, in shops, offices, etc., it's easy to identify, to document the people who work there. But women and children working in other people's homes, in individual flats and individual apartments, it is much harder, especially if we take the case of full-time live-in domestic workers. They hence, exists, according to me, the organization to which I belong, and many other activists. There hence exists, from the region where I'm speaking from, literally a statistical amnesia, or literally a black hole when it comes to the any kind of reliable, quantifiable data on domestic workers. So ultimately, the moment the domestic worker enters the employer's home or hearth, domestic workers are lost from the gaze of the statistician, from the labor officer, from other government officials, and so they're literally not documented. Now, domestic workers, therefore come very easily under the complete control of the employer. The vulnerability of domestic workers in India, in other South Asian countries, is thus very entrenched. And it's reflected in the simple fact that the work that they perform is very hard to quantify, that it varies from house to house. There's so much variation. And this proves this point about just how vulnerable and informal the work is. Now, there's another important aspect to it I want to highlight. Because it is stigmatized work, relegated to the lowest rung of the labor market in India, as well as in other South Asian countries, it's actually allowing for the work process, is actually allowing for reproduction of a lot of racial, caste, community based discrimination, as well as the reproduction of various regional disparities. A country like India has, more rich, wealthier states and pockets compared to, certain other parts of the country. And so we see regional disparities also playing themselves out and being reproduced in the process of domestic work and hiring and the kind of market that exists. Now, in India, after sanitation, municipal work, paid domestic work is the next most stigmatized work, despite the fact that a lot of this work is performed by domestic workers in a very skilled manner. Now, given these conditions, I'd say the need arises for the formal recognition of this work, and the peculiarities of the work process cannot be used to deny that ultimately the employer's home, private home, is a workplace for the worker. After all, the employer's home may be a private space for him or her, but it's not a private space for the domestic worker. Following from this, all the laws which are applicable to other workers, that's respect to the minimum wages law, the trade union legislation law, gratuity, provident fund, maternity benefits at the workplace, these of course need to be made applicable to domestic workers, and we're demanding this. So, this is one of the fundamental demands, recognition of domestic workers in India and in other South Asian countries as workers, and they being given parity with other workers. Now, at the same time, we know that when it comes to labor law or the formulation of new labor laws in line with the ILO Convention 189, there always remains the problem of so-called good laws, but poor implementation. And here I would say that the point is that we need to change the nature of the work itself rather than simply trying to regulate the existing forms of highly individualized paid domestic work. So rather than this work, relation being restricted to a private, individualized employer, employee, or employer domestic worker relationship, it needs to be transformed into a tripartite, a triangular relationship between employer, employee, or that's the domestic worker, mediated by the state. So, our concern is and our demand is that the state should register all domestic workers in India, so be it in all other South Asian countries, and the state, through municipalities, through district administrative offices, etc., allocate such work to households that need it. So just like municipalities allocate sanitation workers to different streets or localities for cleaning, sanitation work, in a similar manner, the municipality or any other state-backed employment exchange registration office will allocate domestic workers where there is a demand. So now we are asking for not just general parity in the labor legislations that already exist, but we're asking for something more. We know that implementation of ILO inspired legislation will always be a problem, especially so in a context where we are seeing a marked jurisprudential shift through which there is a steady withdrawal of the state from regulating all kinds of work relations, not just in the informal sector, but even in the formal sector with large workforces. Thus, for successful implementation of good legislation, we need transformation of the fundamentals of domestic work, the work process itself. Thus, we argue that municipalization imbricates, it positions the state firmly in this domain of work relations where the most vulnerable section of laboring women is actually concentrated.
Thank you very, very much, Maya, for this very good rounding up of your claim. I can really highly recommend everyone who wants to know a little bit more about this this idea of municipalization to read Maya's article in our dossier, which it goes a little bit more into detail. But for the moment, I wanted to also welcome our third guest tonight, or today, wherever you are. Betty Abba, who can also give another perspective to this debate. Betty is a Nigerian advocate for women and children's rights and the founder of the Center for Children's Health, Education, Orientation and Protection, See Hope, and an NGO for the rights and development of marginalized young people, including female domestic workers. With the support of the West Africa office of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, she also conducted a podcast on the topic that you can find on this website that you just can see with Anchor FM. So, Betty, what also like summing up on what our other panelists already said, what are the main problems for domestic workers in Nigeria, and especially the young women you are working with? And what are the demands you formulate against this background?
Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Hello, we can hear you. You can start if you want.
Oh, okay, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and I've really gained a lot of insights into the presentation so far. Talking about domestic worker struggle in Nigeria, about rights and dignity of labor and labor's rights, I would say that it's very, very important to look at cultural context. Paid care work, I would say, in the Nigerian context, is a relatively new concept, and somehow to some persons is foreign. For some others, before now, it didn't even exist, because you have the fostering system where families in the cities or in townships bring their younger relatives to live with them and work. So the concept of paying domestic workers is relatively new. So we have a long history of domestic workers struggling to be heard, a long history of the dehumanization of domestic workers, especially young domestic workers, and especially in a country that is who are battling with the issue of patriarchy. And you see that many of these domestic workers, as Alex has already read out, majority are females, majority are women. And we're beginning to see increasingly underage children, especially teenage girls, in paid domestic labor. And this is informed by the state of economy, especially in the COVID-19 era. So many families are going into distress. So many families can barely survive. And so what goes on now is families, especially in rural areas, in poor corners of the cities, sending their children, taking them out of school and sending them into paid labor in people's homes. And as Maya had already articulated, the level of work is not quantified. These people most time do not have a voice. I can say that in Nigeria, there's no organized force or organized union of domestic workers. It hardly ever exists. What you have are agents and agencies that are busy recruiting persons, including underage children, underage persons, into paid domestic work. And the major issues we're beginning to see is a general dehumanization of these persons, especially the young women and girls. The dehumanization and sexual abuse is extremely rife. Recently, our organization opened a shelter, and basically, it was targeted originally at women that are impacted by domestic violence, women and girls. But increasingly, we're beginning to see teenagers coming into the house. The large majority of the residents are actually teenagers who were in paid domestic work, who have been sexually abused, who have been maltreated, terribly maltreated. And because there are no unions, because of the weak state of our law enforcement, there are hardly any kind of legal redress. And so the shelters are coming to their aid to see how we could, and most times they're sent back to their parents, and we're not even sure if these parents would send them back to other employers. And this circle of oppression, this circle of dehumanization, this circle of sexual abuse continues. I just want to cite just three cases I have dealt with in the last few years. A young teen, just to be able to capture the state of the dehumanized state of young domestic workers in Nigeria and their apparent helplessness or obvious helplessness. Sometimes in 2016, one of the first cases of domestic workers who had to handle a young girl who had been impregnated, who was 6 months pregnant, and was left stranded at a major bus terminus. She had no money to go back to the rural area where she came from, and then she had been dumped at that terminus. She was 6 months pregnant, and she had no idea who was responsible for that pregnancy. Now, in the previous 9 months before we met her, she had worked in 4 places, and out of the 4 places, she had been sexually abused in 3 of them. So she had no idea who she was actually pregnant for. And when we decided to take her to the authorities, they were not able to help. They were helpless. And she had to go back to her parents without any kind of arrest, any kind of there were initial arrests, but there was no prosecution. And this is just like a little dot, a tip of the iceberg of what goes on. Just last year, we had the case of a domestic worker who was found hanging in the bedroom of her employer where she worked. And there are so many indications that was a frame-up suicide. By the initial investigation of the police, she had been beaten up because she was found to have eaten part of the food in the house that she wasn't expected to eat. And so in the process, we assume she died in the process of being brutalized. But the next thing we saw was the picture of her hanging. And from all indications, she could not have hung herself. She couldn't have committed suicide over accusation of eating. So you see domestic workers dying even in the employment of the employees, of their employers. And at the end of the day, nothing comes out of it. We made noise, we went to the media and all of that. As we speak, the case is still there, and there has been no conclusive prosecution concerning that case. There's so many cases that we've had to deal with over time. So there's a major lapse in prosecution. There's a major lapse in the work of the law enforcement agencies in reducing or stopping the dehumanization of domestic workers in Nigeria. And I would say that why this case is on a rise is that the employers weaponize the poverty of these parents. Because Nigeria right now is according to World Bank statistics, is a global capital of poverty. And this is not just theory. You see a lot of families being impoverished. a lot of persons losing jobs, even in the informal sectors, the economy is just struggling, a lot of struggle. So families are finding it extremely hard to cope. And so they have had to give up out their children. And then these children are completely at the mercy of their employers. And the law enforcement agencies are either helpless or just look the other way. So I believe that one of the ways that we can address this issue is to sensitize even the domestic workers on their rights, because many of these workers, the domestic workers, are not even aware of their human rights. They're not aware that what is being done to them is contrary to their laws and that their human rights have been abused. They are being dehumanized. And so they have to be that consciousness. They have to be sensitized. And then there has to be a conscious move to coordinate the kind of the struggle for domestic workers. There has to be a coordination of unionism among the domestic workers, so that they can be heard, so that they can insist on their rights, so that they can insist on their dignity of labor and unfair treatment as workers. In Nigeria, you have teachers union, we have doctors union, we have nurses union, we have even a market women union, traders. But there's absolutely no domestic workers union. And like I said earlier, it all arises from the concept of the strangeness of paid domestic work. People don't believe that if you work in your relative's house, you're supposed to be paid, but the world has changed. And so people are now working for complete strangers. So the concept of paying them is still a little bit new. But since it has come to stay, and this is our reality, domestic workers have to be shown, have to be treated fairly. They have to insist on fair treatment, and they have to be visible, and their rights have to be respected. So there's need for a mobilization of domestic workers so that they can have a union and so that they can have a better voice in Nigeria. And especially, we have to be on the lookout for the rights of young persons who have been taken from school, who have been sexually abused, whose futures have been damaged because of the poverty of their homes and the situations they found themselves in domestic work. That has to be a major conscious movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Betty, for this first intervention. We will come back to the topic of unions. I think all three of your interventions already made very clear ones, like different problems that face domestic workers in your different continents or regions, but as well moments where the convention of the ILO is not reaching because it's more about poverty, more about stigmatized work, more about the immigration status that Deborah was mentioning also, or the diplomatic personnel, the problem that they always often use their legal possibilities to abuse domestic workers, which the International Domestic Workers Organization also wrote an article about in our dossier. But now I wanted to also going in this direction on how difficult, in which difficult situations domestic workers are organizing. I'm very happy also that although they are not here, I can also present the collective Territorio Domestico through a video statement. Territorio Domestico is a group of feminist, migrant and local women, domestic workers and allies in the Spanish state. And in the following video we are watching now, the group Territorio Domestico articulates their demands regarding the Convention 189, but also analyzes its limits and what it means to go, and that's the name of our dossier, go beyond 189. So happy to hear them.
Territorio Doméstico es un colectivo de mujeres de diferentes partes del mundo, incluyendo compañeras de aquí de España, autóctonas, que luchamos por unos derechos, por que se nos valore, por la igualdad, y lo hacemos con diferentes metodologías. Hemos utilizado metodologías desde pasar el fashion, canciones, bailes y música. Somos feministas, o sea, porque defendemos nuestros derechos también, porque siempre recae en nosotras las mujeres el mayor peso de los cuidados.
Con otros colectivos, nosotras reivindicamos el trabajo de hogar y cuidados, porque nosotras no solo limpiamos, no solo planchamos, no solo cocinamos, nosotras también cuidamos, y cuidamos a personas esenciales en el funcionamiento de la vida, a los niños, a las personas mayores, a las niñas, para que las otras personas puedan trabajar. Entonces, para nosotras es muy importante que se reconozcan a los cuidados como parte esencial de lo que mueve la vida. Para nosotras es muy importante que se ratifique el convenio 189, porque equipara el empleo de hogar con el de cualquier otro trabajador o trabajadora. Nos da la posibilidad de tener la prestación por desempleo, que las empleadas de hogar no tenemos ahora, y también una jubilación digna.
No es callarnos y decirnos que se va a ratificar, hacerse la foto y punto, sino es la aplicación real de ese convenio, ¿no? Que estamos esperando ya hace 11 años.
La mayoría de mujeres que hacen el trabajo de hogar y cuidados somos mujeres y migrantes, y muchas no están regularizadas. Entonces nosotros creemos que tiene que estar dentro y que se tiene que regularizar y reconocer el trabajo que están haciendo. Que muchas en España el empleo de hogar de las empleadas internas es un empleo esclavizante y no dice nada con respecto a esto. Y vemos que está fuera y que no incluye en el 189 tratar a los cuidados como parte esencial del trabajo que nosotras hacemos. Que nosotras somos trabajadoras de hogar y cuidados, porque no es que solo estamos haciendo un trabajo que hasta un robot podría hacer, pero nosotras estamos cuidando y para nosotras es muy importante reivindicar eso.
Creo que alrededor del 189 sí que pueden haber unas grandes alianzas porque hay muchísimas trabajadoras de hogar, muchos colectivos, muchas organizaciones que están a nivel internacional que también están con ese tema, ¿no? En que en otros países se ha ratificado el convenio 189, pero no se ha aplicado con las medidas necesarias, ¿no? Y que tienen que hacerse. Y luego otros países que no está ratificado. Ya sabemos que más de 30 países latinoamericanos está ratificado el 189 y en Europa más de 10 o 12 países. Pero sí que veíamos que podía haber una alianza en juntarnos, que cuando se haga la ratificación del convenio 189 de la OIT en España, nosotras ya estamos preparadas con el discurso. Queremos la ratificación del 189, pero queremos ir más allá y es la aplicación de los derechos, estar en el régimen general con todos los derechos de las trabajadoras y de las cuidadoras, que ir más allá del 189 es esto, ¿no? Una reorganización de los cuidados, una vida para todas y para todos que sea digna y con condiciones y que se deje de ver que hay unas vidas que valen más que otras.
Nosotros luchamos por nuestros derechos como trabajadoras del hogar, pero también luchamos por derechos sociales. Por ejemplo, la educación. Muchas de las compañeras que venimos de otros países a veces vienen con sus hijos o hay reagrupación familiar. Entonces, el derecho fundamental al estudio, a la educación, es fundamental. El derecho a la sanidad pública universal también, porque hubo un momento que, y aún se nos sigue negando, a las personas que no están cotizando se nos siguen negando ese derecho a una tarjeta sanitaria. Nos atienden, pero con muchas dificultades. Por la vivienda es otro derecho fundamental, porque nosotras, muchas tenemos la necesidad de estar rentando un piso, por decir así, para poder vivir, y eso también está en contra de nosotros, porque al no tener un contrato tampoco te arriendan, y si te arriendan, pues carísimo. O sea, todas las luchas sociales, las principales, no nos afectan a nosotras. Entonces, por eso también no solo defendemos nuestros derechos como trabajadoras del hogar y los cuidados, sino que también las luchas sociales.
¡Arriba el territorio doméstico!
Si eres trabajadora o el paro te sienta mal, únete a nuestra lucha contra la precariedad, con papeles y ellos.
I think what in this video came was very clear as well, that our comrades from Territorio Domestico spoke about like the organizing in difficult contexts, as you mentioned, all three of you mentioned before as well. But at the same time, they were already also talking about a great variety of struggles, of social struggles, only because of the position they were put in our society. And then in this sense, and also taking up different things you mentioned before, like the difficulties of organizing in unions or in other social struggles, I wanted to pose the same question to all three of you. And it would be, how does organizing for domestic workers function in this complex context of hyper-exploitation and discrimination? And what is the relation to feminist and anti-racist social movements, not to mention traditional trade unions? Deborah, you mentioned before that it's one a recommendation, or one claim you have, that they are domestic workers are able to join the unions and to join other social struggles. But what is the reality of that today? And could you explain that a little bit? Which alliances you have and how you are organizing? You are still unmuted.
Okay. As I have said earlier, that the work of migrant domestic worker is done in isolation, in the sphere of, the private sphere, private home of employers. So it's not like workers working in factories where they are all together and it's easy to to gather them and to get organized. But for migrant women workers, domestic workers, it's really difficult because they work in isolation. They have limited time to devote for organizing and for joining associations. So it's really a big challenge for us to encourage or motivate migrant domestic workers to participate in self-organized associations. So I believe that since migrant domestic workers are part of the working class, we're part of the working people, we should be able to have alliances with the working class movement, and also with other people's movement like solidarity movement, the social movement, and racism movement, anti-racist movement. So it's important for us to to be part of that movement, to use that as a platform for us to be able to amplify our voice, and at the same time to advocate for the protection of the rights of migrant rights and welfare of migrant domestic workers. So in regard to the Convention 189, it's really after 10 years, there are only 30 countries who have ratified So, and we all know that in other conventions have the same issues, because the UN Convention for the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and their families, after 30 years, only 50 countries have ratified. So we really have a long way to go. So it's important for us to have an alliance, what's this, a transnational alliance, so that we could really campaign globally for the ratification of the convention, so that the ratification is just one aspect of the convention, but how it could be translated into the local legislation is another thing. So it's really a work that has to be done, but it will take quite a long process. And so that's why it's important for us to join all the movements that we could be part of, being so that we'll be able to use that as our strength, to increase our visibility, and at the same time strengthen our voice and our empowerment.
Can I ask you about that? Because, like you said, it's very important. But could you also maybe give some examples where you're already doing it? Because you were also referring to the convention and the ratification of the convention, but at the same time, many problems of migrant women, especially, are not covered in the convention. So, in which how you work, for example?
A clear example is for our organization. We try to be part of the labor union here, and we were invited, and we participated in the cleaning union. But then again, this cleaning union are mostly women, local women, who are working for few hours with different what's this payments. So migrant women who joined the trade union just felt isolated, because they have their own particular issues that has not been addressed by the trade union. For example, the immigration status. They have issues with work permits, residence permit, which the trade union tried to avoid. So if these main issues are not addressed, then it's useless for migrant domestic workers to join the trade union. Otherwise, all the more they will feel isolated.
And one last question. Did you have, in this moment, you just mentioned, did you have after that a broader alliance with other migrant communities or the anti-racist movement in Greece?
Yeah. Okay. So we are part of the anti-racist movement here in Greece. However, when we talk about the Convention 189, nobody is aware of it. So it's like you're talking of something that doesn't exist, because it's something that people don't know nothing about. So it's sometimes frustrating to campaign for the ratification and for for the change in the legislation, labor legislation, because it's people are not aware that a convention has been promulgated, and it's the responsibility of the government to be able to ratify it and translate it into their national legislation. So it's really we tried working with the anti-racist organizations and other movements here, but nobody's aware of the convention. you know. So it's really important to have a global campaign on this, and if RLS could, you know, could anchor this, it would be, you know, a great, you know, support for the plight of domestic workers, you know.
I'm not sure if I can just now promise you a global campaign, but we are obviously we are eager to follow up the topic also on an international level, and to see in this exchange is not the beginning, but the one step in it. And just about the same question, I wanted to ask you, Betty, because you also already mentioned that there's no domestic workers union at all, and there's no representations in the traditional unions. So how is your relationship, or the relationship of domestic workers and their organizing to other social struggles, the feminist struggle, women's struggle?
Okay,
Well,
thank you so much.
yeah, our experience
Okay.
working with,
Sorry.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I was addressing Betty with this question.
Okay.
But, sorry, we are going.
Thank you so much. I would say that, like I earlier mentioned, it's good to have some kind of context to the peculiar situation we find ourselves in Nigeria. Currently, we have what is supposed to be a democratic government, but in all its characteristics, in all its forms, actions, body language, it's more of a military dictatorship. So this permeates into the entire system, where there's a lot of resistance to organized labor, resistance to descending voices. There's a lot of resistance to people having a voice. So you see some major banks saying we do not allow unionism here. Some major corporations said no, you cannot have unions. And so when you try to juxtapose that with that of domestic workers. Now domestic workers are essentially struggling with stigmatization. They're essentially struggling with the perception that they are not even formal workers. They're not recognized. They've not been part of any union. So it's extremely hard, and it's a major new, like a new emerging thought to have organized labor, to have domestic workers be part of the organized labor, to demand for rights, to demand for respect, to demand for labor rights, to demand for visibility, and to demand to have their voices heard, especially against the backdrop of the dehumanization, the very widespread dehumanization that I've personally seen, especially with young female domestic workers. So it's a new concept. And part of how we've tried to address it is to start this podcast that the Rosa Luxemburg has graciously assisted us with. Last year, we started a podcast on domestic violence, and we found out that a major part of the domestic violence is not just about intimate partners. It also has to do with um, uh, uh, domestic workers. And we have people who over the years have been dehumanized, have been sexually abused, and they've lived with that stigma 20, 30 years. And they were part of the people that spoke out in the course of the series of podcasts that we've had. So, and now in the next 3 months, we're starting another podcast specifically dedicated to the issues of domestic workers. So we're going to have domestic workers talk. We're going to point out the laws, the areas, the loopholes in our laws that have refused to recognize the rights, the dignity, and even the survival of domestic workers. And then at the end of the day, we'll put it on radio. And radio is extremely popular in Nigeria to be able to, so that we can target the entire populace. First, the listening public and also domestic workers. So be aware of the rights of domestic workers and our policy makers, because the ILO 189 is one of the conventions, the ILO conventions that one of the 55 conventions that Nigeria hasn't signed. And I can tell you that without some kind of advocacy, without some kind of pressure, that our policymakers, the relevant stakeholders, will not see that as a priority, because most of them don't even recognize the rights not to mention the dignity and otherwise of domestic workers. So it has to be by conscious effort to amplify the voices of these people, to make sure they are part of the organized labor. When I went to South Africa and I heard that domestic workers were part of a major nationwide protest, I was surprised. And I understand that it's a huge movement in South Africa. And South Africa is just our neighbor right on the same continent. So why can't we have organized labor? But you know what? It started with someone. It didn't start, it has not been there for eternity. It started one day with a lot of consciousness, a lot of organizing, a lot of noise to be able to bring it to the front burners so that people can talk about the rights of domestic workers. People who have been hurt in the process can open up and the issues can be addressed. The issues of stigma, all kinds of abuse that domestic workers have faced over the years and continue to face in terms of how they are underpaid, they're sexually abused, they're treated as non-humans. And I think Deborah mentioned that one of the issues is that they're isolated, so it's extremely hard for them to organize. And in the course of the isolation, a lot of things go on. Like the girl who had been sexually abused in 3 out of the 4 houses she had worked within 9 months. And it's actually widespread in a place like Lagos where I live. Female domestic workers, especially teenagers, extremely prevalent. And then the one who actually died in the course of serving her employers. She was just 17 years, a young girl. And so I believe that this has to be through conscious effort to bring in other women's rights activists, other relevant stakeholders in the movement, so that we can bring along the issues and make conscious effort to ensure that domestic workers are part of the labor movement.
One question to you, Betty, a follow-up question on that. So I did understand you write there's not yet a women's movement who is taking up the topic. So not only the labor movement is not yet aware of of domestic workers, but also there's no like women's rights organization or feminist organization talking about the topic. And the other question would be like, if you already, because you said also that the domestic workers still quite new phenomena in Nigeria, and if how they meet, how do they meet, for example, through your organization and just start, how can I imagine they starting to talk about the problems they face?
Yes, I think the last question, domestic work and domestic workers is not a new concept. We've always had the need for, in families where persons come and work to help out with chores, especially if the parents, the mother, the father of the house are busy, especially with the demands of the modern world. So domestic work is not essentially new. What is relatively new is paid domestic labor. We've had cousins, we have all kinds of persons helping out in the house for free for years. I remember a case in the UK where a Nigerian couple took a young boy to the UK, and for about 19 years, between 12 to 19, over a decade, he worked with them as a domestic worker, and he wasn't paid. He wasn't sent to school. And at the end of the day, he was found out and he reported to the authorities, and the couple were sent to jail. That happened in the UK a couple of years back. I can tell you that happens all the time here, especially people weaponizing poverty against their vulnerable relatives, their vulnerable neighbors, their vulnerable fellow citizens. So it's not exactly new, but getting paid, being respected, and being less discriminated, being not stigmatized is a new concept. And I believe that we have to pursue it to ensure that they're not just being paid pittances, that they're being paid according to the law, that there are set rules, and that there are standard wages that they can get as payments, not just seeing them as working in the houses as a privilege, but as a right, that they have a right like all workers, like all traders. and they have to be treated like human beings and workers that are entitled to get wages. Yes, and also the other question, I believe that right now, I'm not aware of any domestic workers movement in Nigeria. No, there's absolutely no union for domestic workers in Nigeria. But we have for teachers, for workers, domestic, for teachers, for doctors. They are not part of the organized union. And I believe that we can make it part of the organized union. And one of the ways that we can bring it about is to bring in feminists, to bring in women's rights activists, especially because majority of these workers are women. They're young, promising women who have found themselves in domestic work. And most of the time, it's assumed that they are there because they are disempowered, they are less educated, they are from very poor background. And so these people, the employers, prey on their vulnerability. So we have to be able to insist on their rights as women, as girls, as human beings, as domestic workers. And one of the ways we can, one of the entry points is for gender activists to be able to take on this role of organizing and amplifying the voices of female domestic workers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that also accounts for many countries that like there's a stronger link between outspoken feminist movement and the domestic workers movement could be like a great potential. But just with the same question, I wanted to address you, Maya, also because you are yourself part of a domestic workers union, so very different from what the others already told us. So how is organizing possible in India and in this already complex situation? But now, I mean, India is raging with COVID, and also like Betty said before, with a very, very difficult government. So how is organizing possible? What are the alliances that you have?
Thank you for the question. I would like to say and start with, flagging that, there are many issues which are currently triggering collective struggles and mobilizations of domestic workers in India. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, that the highly privatized nature of the workplace and the lack of state regulation literally allows the employer's writ to run large, and therefore domestic workers in India are suffering all kinds of exploitation. Which includes, rampant sexual harassment, rape, and even murder. And the horrifying part is that so many homicide cases are brushed under the carpet by the state agencies, particularly the police. How illegal confinement of domestic workers in the workplace are so easily brushed aside, and how false allegations by employers about theft by domestic workers, really goes to show the kind of connivance between the police and employers, which is like an everyday phenomena. In fact, police harassment, picking up of workers on the basis of the whims and fancies and allegations of employers and taking them to the police station is a very typical format. And what this has done is it has triggered a lot of collective action on the ground by domestic workers. So we find that, domestic workers are organizing against these malpractices like illegal confinement in these high-rise, residential complexes. They're mobilizing against police atrocities. They're coming together, discussing and fighting back against these, trends of, false charges so easily being laid down by employers. On domestic workers, and how that triggers then unemployment, because what's happening is, especially in these high-rise complexes, residential complexes, is that one employer has a conflict with you, then they will blacklist you and pursue what is known as quote unquote no entry into the complex. And so if you were a domestic worker working in another apartment or 4 other apartments, you lose out on work because you are being debarred by one employer. So this kind of arbitrary action where the employers writ the private power really, comes out. We find the domestic workers are fighting against this. Now, workers' organizations, domestic workers' organizations in India, are somewhat facilitated, in these kind of workplaces that have emerged, particularly these high-rise residential complexes where large numbers of workers are actually reporting to work. These are these apartment complexes where there are 300, 400, 500, apartments. And so you can imagine in almost each of them, there's a worker who goes to work. So the huge numbers actually do, have this opportunity of congregating or coming together. And also this kind of workplace that has emerged, information about maltreatment by employers tends to spread like wildfire. All the more because not only are these workers coming to work in large numbers in the same kind of building complex, but they also are sharing very often the same working class neighborhood or slum where they actually go to return and live. And the rest of their life is spent in these slums. And even those locales are becoming crucial spaces for actually mobilizing domestic workers in India. In fact, domestic workers are concentrated in very large numbers in certain kinds of neighborhoods in cities, such as large slums sandwiched between, high-rise buildings or corporate offices, or in the outskirts, these slums in the outskirts of the cities with huge number of people living on rent. Again, unregulated rent rates are a huge problem in these slums. Now, organization is proving fruitful in these kind of locales because again in one place we are seeing large numbers congregate. Now increasingly therefore we see neighborhood-based struggles around conflicts with state agencies such as the police very often coming out and actually coming onto the streets. We also see not just issues pertaining to something that happened in the workplace, which is then triggering a reaction from workers, but we're also seeing certain kinds of neighborhood concerns, certain broader social problems also elicit collectivization and mobilization of workers, domestic workers. So we see that domestic workers on issues specific to their neighborhoods, their slums, such as the lack of water, the lack of safety, etc., is also fueling some very important, wider alliances between this workforce and other migrant workers living in large numbers in the same kind of slum, in the same kind of locale. Now, another important, point that, I would like to share is that employers of domestic workers have, of course, evolved their own mechanisms, formal and informal, of keeping, keeping wages low, keeping wages offered in a particular building complex or in a particular locality low. Now, and of course, regulating very poor working conditions across the board, ensuring that the same working conditions are enforced by all employers. Now, in response to this kind of mechanisms used by employers, we find that domestic workers are also evolving their own techniques, and they are getting organized in the bid to collectively assert that no domestic worker, should be working below a certain, wage rate that, collectively has been decided, and should definitely not settle for, working conditions which are lower than a certain level that, has been collectively agreed upon. Of course, this is a difficult task because, domestic workers in India are a large migrant workforce, and there are new entrants joining the workforce almost every day. But still, this effort is emerging that, we're trying to enforce through our own collectives a certain kind of minimum wage in the area. Nothing on pen and paper, but something that's, that they are willing to fight for. Now, on the issue of the legislation, fights a concerted effort to see through, demand certain kinds of legislative reform. The more organized and conscious segment of domestic workers are obviously the ones who are seen raising and connecting to this issue very quickly. Common workers, the common domestic workers are, on the other hand, getting organized more on the basis of, everyday conflicts and conflagrations with respect to work-related issues and, with respect to police harassment. Now, of course, we are also seeing the gradual emergence, of consciousness, a greater consciousness amongst domestic workers about the need for state regulation, about the need for the state to regulate and monitor this industry. There is a sense also amongst more advanced workers that we are workers, we are doing work, and so where the hell is the state? Where the hell is the tripartite kind of structure we see in other kinds of work relations? Now, recognition of the need for a nodal agency, a state-backed nodal agency that registers domestic workers, that regulates where they're going to work, how much they're working, can be seen as gradually emerging. And these kind of nodal registration offices are seen as helping overcome an otherwise very individualized, very informal work agreements that domestic workers are trapped in. It's also seen as a solution by more conscious workers, as a way of bringing about a standard and doing away with the huge variation and negotiation with a multitude of employers. Now, such nodal registration offices that also allocate domestic work to households, rather than just, so they're enabling the workers and lifting them out of the situation where they have to negotiate with multitude of employers. And it's also helping, it's also seen by domestic workers that as a space which also enables their collective action, also is facilitating greater organization of workers. Now, to elaborate on this point, let me just remind everyone in the audience that, even when the best of law is being thought about, when it's being formulated, and right now in the ILO Convention 189's context, there is this talk of, where's the legislation, let's bring it in. Let's also remember that the question haunts us, who is going to implement it? And we know for a fact that the state is not going to do this. It's not going to implement, good legislation, protective legislation, until there is a pressure from below, until, collective pressure has been facilitated and is very much concretely there. So we need solutions. We need to think in terms of solutions that facilitate workers to organize and collectively assert, and ensure that there's a proper legislation and implementation of that legislation, which I think, bringing in the state through a tripartite structure will actually facilitate. Now, because domestic workers also belong to the lowest rung of the labor market, they're highly exploited, they constitute the segment which comes from oppressed castes, oppressed linguistic and other oppressed communities, and backward regions. So this is also the space where a lot of stigma is getting reproduced daily. Many a times, anti-caste, anti-race, etc. Movements and organizations therefore can be seen coming into play and playing an important role in bringing into the forefront labor issues, the issues of conflict between the police and domestic workers and police high-handedness. But having said this, the workplace related struggles and organization of domestic workers is foremost important, because at times the workers being divided along different caste groups, different racial groups, different regions, linguistic communities, etc., do sometimes tend to be divided amongst themselves, which only a workplace solidarity, a unity, workplace politics can actually help them overcome. I also want to mention two more points here, and this is that there's been discussion on how the feminist movement can play an important role as an ally. The region where I come from, mainstream feminist movement, the mainstream women's movement, just like the mainstream trade union movement, can also be accused and has been accused of actually pushing to the sidelines, not in fact addressing working class women, and that's domestic workers, for example, issues, and making them the center of the movement, the women's movement. Now, I have written on this issue of a class divided mainstream feminist movement, a class divided women's movement on many platforms. I would just say at this juncture on this platform that there are concrete contradictions between women. I mean, look at the madam-maid relationship itself. There's a woman who's subletting her work on a cheaply available domestic worker, often from an oppressed community or caste, and we cannot overlook that deep class contradiction and how much of it actually becomes a center issue for the women's movement. It's not. In reality, it's not. Plus, I argue that workplace collectivization, workplace politics, class-conscious politics that highlights the issues of domestic workers, makes them central to all social movements, is actually very crucial. Now, having said this, unfortunately, in the existing trade union movement, just like in the mainstream women's movement, not enough is being done to mobilize domestic workers. Now, this stems from the general crisis. In my country, the trade union movement has been in a retreat for a long time, not just in terms of informal workers, but even formal sector workers. We are seeing, the trade union movement languish. And so it's not surprising in this kind of context that, informal workers like domestic workers are not quickly or easily prioritized. Nevertheless, organizations of domestic workers is an emerging reality, and established trade union federations are being pushed into raising domestic workers' issues, given the building up pressure of domestic workers from below. So with these observations, I'd like to end.
Thanks so much, Maya. You already included so much that I can't pose a follow-up question because you already answered them. Yeah, I think there's a lot to discuss on it. About the contradiction in the women's feminist movement, but also contradictions in unions, contradictions in other social struggles. And to show one positive example of also unionizing a group that unionized that was is discriminated elsewhere. Sorry for that. And their connections with the feminist movement or feminist groups is two video statements we want to share from Paraguay. The one is the experience of Sintra Dindi. That's a union of indigenous domestic workers in Paraguay. And the other one is from Casa Fem. That's a feminist collective working alongside them. So let's hear them about their experience.
Soy Venancia Cáceres, soy de la comunidad guaraní Huopelendá y estoy en una organización que estamos llevando después de 11 años formado con el pueblo indígena, que es Comisión Consejo Indígena, con la ayuda de sindicatos del Central de Asunción, que es CULA, y hace 11 años la lucha de los trabajadores con los hombres. Después nosotros entramos, rompemos el miedo, procuramos para que se forme esta organización de mujeres indígenas en el Chaco Central, que es Sintren. Bueno, y lo que puedo contar también, que las mujeres indígenas necesitan también un apoyo, una organización que les puede defender en su trabajo como doméstica, porque hay todavía mucha discriminación hacia las mujeres indígenas trabajadoras domésticas. Bueno, y siempre y cuando procuramos de llevar para conocer más esta organización, cómo llevar con la ayuda de la CUAP y juntamente también con el Consejo de Pueblos Indígenas. También quiero recalcar que la organización indígena quiere llegar, concientizar a las mujeres. Y nuestro nuestra doméstica falta mucho de conocer, no tener miedo, romper esas cosas de miedo para que ellos también puedan defender mismo con diálogo con su patronal. Bueno, y hablar un poco en Paraguay, que siempre hay mucha falta de llevar este trabajo doméstico. Pero así también nosotros tenemos un objetivo. Nuestro objetivo es fortalecer la organización con el sindicato de trabajadoras domésticas en Paraguay. Porque se tiene que cumplir la ley, en donde corresponde, en donde dice que la ley hay que ser un sueldo mínimo, un sueldo digno para las trabajadoras. Y nosotros pensamos que ese se tiene que cumplir a través de las ayudas de las compañeras nacionales, internacionales, en donde está la OIT, donde está la Club A, para que nosotros podamos tener esa fuerza, esa fortaleza y fortalecer las organizaciones.
Consequently es una casa cultural que está ubicada en Asunción, Paraguay, que se sostiene específicamente del trabajo doméstico. Para nosotros es un acto político el hacer el trabajo doméstico y la militancia feminista.
CasaFem se articula con diferentes organizaciones a nivel nacional e internacional. Actualmente formamos parte de diferentes redes, como por ejemplo la red de espacios culturales del casco histórico de Asunción, que aglutina 11 espacios culturales, y donde CasaFem es el espacio feminista que coloca la cuestión de género y la importancia de visibilizar el trabajo doméstico que hacen las mujeres para sostener las actividades culturales. También nos articulamos con organizaciones que son principalmente feministas a nivel regional, como por ejemplo las feministas de la Via Yala, con quien venimos trabajando sobre cuestiones de los feminismos a nivel regional. Esta es la primera vez que nos estamos acercando a organizaciones que están trabajando específicamente la cuestión del trabajo doméstico y creemos que es muy importante seguir construyendo estos lazos.
Uno de los objetivos de nuestra lucha es instalar el tema del trabajo doméstico, debatir sobre este tema que nos parece muy importante también dentro de este contexto de precarización laboral que tenemos ahora mismo. Como CasaFem nos parece importante reivindicar el trabajo doméstico, ya que nosotras como militantes feministas realizamos este trabajo antes de cada actividad y después también. Entonces nosotras como feministas reivindicamos el trabajo doméstico porque es un acto político.
En Paraguay, hace unos años, se aprobó la ley del trabajo doméstico gracias a la lucha de las mujeres trabajadoras domésticas organizadas, y a nosotras como CasaFem nos parece importante poder hacer un seguimiento sobre cómo se encuentra esa ley y cómo podemos también seguir aportando en el cumplimiento de la misma.
So this is for me a very good example where like alliances work as well. Still understanding that not in every case that is not in every country that's the case. I want to take the chance just now to pick up two questions that came in from through Facebook, and they are both to Maya in this sense. I think the second one will be also for everyone, but there is the question to Maya: how can you formalize an informal system? So if everything is outside of regulations, how do you get it into a state regulated system, like you said? And which are the ways to provide also support to middle class women who are responsible for the domestic workers? How to include them? I think that would mean. And the other question, also to Maya, and then amplifying it, is about the caste system in India and its relevance to discrimination of domestic workers. You already mentioned it a little bit, but how is it working together, contradicting, laying across our class, the class division? And I think it would be interesting, like to ask anyone how different forms of discrimination come together in this. So these are two questions from the audience. I wanted to have a quick round about it. But Maya, you were addressed. So how can you formalize an informalized system?
See, it takes us back to the essential point, which is that domestic work is being carried out through these informal, highly exploitative work agreements, because precisely the workplace is not seen as a space where a contractual relationship is being forged in an open public domain. The workplace, being employer's home, is taken as an excuse for the state to keep out of any kind of regulation of this domestic work relationship. So, by arguing for formalization, what we are saying is, and this is important to understand, that it's not enough. Okay, and this is where I think the ILO Convention 189 somewhere limited itself by assuming that we can defend the rights of individual domestic workers just by ensuring that the individual contracts between an individual domestic worker and an individual employer gets some kind of formal leanings. It's put down in some kind of paper, but has some kind of written form to it, as if individual formal work contracts themselves are self-regulatory, or themselves will ensure the end to exploitation, heightened exploitation of domestic workers. What I am saying is precisely that's not going to work. You can't have formalization in a model where it's just going to remain between an individual employee and employee negotiating some kind of written contract. You need to bring in the state. And when you bring in the state and force the state to come and mediate the very nature of this work, to help quantify the skill, the hours, the wage rate, everything that's so fundamental to the work process, you've changed the whole game. You've changed the whole informal nature, core structure. So I think the solution actually lies, and that's why we need to go beyond Convention 189, is to realize that we need to imbricate the state, bring in a tripartite structure of regulation when it comes to domestic work. And it starts with the state being forced through municipalities, through other sub-state bodies, to register these workers and to actually be the nodal agency around which they will be sent or allocated to households for work. And that becomes a space also for domestic workers to actually more easily collectivize and force through their rights. You see, it's easier to negotiate with a particular registration officer or a particular agency, rather than trying to at the gate of a high-rise building where you've been locked out through the no entry, provision of an employer, being locked out, how can you anyways negotiate your individual contract, even if it was in written? It needs, the kind of intervention we need is to bring the state in a tripartite, mechanism and structure to domestic work. And we need to therefore emphasize that this is not a private workplace, it's a proper formal workplace. About, the second question, or the second part of the question, I didn't catch. Could I have it
was
repeated?
which are the ways to provide also support to middle class women who are responsible for the domestic workers?
You see, I think that, if we push through, and I really appeal to, the international community, I think there is need for an international consensus for new theoretical reflections on this question of domestic work. It's not enough just pushing for one more law in the light of the ILO convention, because implementation is always going to be a problem. We're going to have to push for a new kind of work process to completely change the game and change the nature of the work. And once you do that, you also change the condition of employers. If you have a state-regulated, a state-backed employment exchange, it also standardizes things for the employer. It also ensures that, employers also are guaranteed a certain minimum standard of work, and that they are also going to be provided certain kinds of skilled labor and a certain amount of surety, which today also does not exist. Let us remember that there are these, lots of tussles between madams and maids, or because, there is these negotiations about when the worker is going to come in and work, if she's 10 minutes late or half an hour late because she's negotiating with another madam in another flat, all that gets more streamlined. So I think somewhere, these kind of interim measures like municipalization of domestic work, and of course the wider struggle for the socialization of this labor is going to benefit even middle class women or upper class household women. The greater socialization, of course, of this labor is the longer goal, the long term goal. We have to also aspire for that, which I feel the mainstream women's movement has failed to do. And I feel that many mainstream feminist activists in my country unhesitatingly employ domestic workers and don't see or engage with this contradiction in their position. So, I would like to say that some of the solutions that I've tabled here and flagged for you also will streamline, the access of employers to workers in conditions which are more humane and more sustainable.
Knowing that there's another question, but only because I think the question from the audience was to this very new idea, I think, of at least in a broader context. I haven't discussed it yet. So I would really like to ask Deborah and Betty. I mean, it's a like very spontaneous question, but if you could imagine something for your countries, like pushing for state organized agencies for domestic workers, or what do you think from your perspective about it? Debbie, you're still muted still?
I think on the part of the migrant domestic associations, we have to find a more creative way of getting across what we demand. For example, in our case, we do festivals, we attend festivals, and we even organize our cultural festivals, inviting employers, getting them, engage them in our activities, and at the same time, educating them on their duties as employers, to treat their employers in a humane way, and also trying to to get hold of the media people, friendly media people, to create a what we call a positive narrative. So instead of just, telling about exploitation, telling about the issues, problems that migrant domestic workers, so why not, talk about the contribution, the positive contributions of migrant domestic workers in the country or in Europe, because migrant have really contributed a lot in terms of social and economic what's the situation here in here in Europe. So and yet migrant domestic workers are not valued. So it's important for the people, for the employers to see the positive contribution of migrant domestic workers in their family and in the country as well. So media has a lot of work, or the social media could be used to address and to uh, amplify the situation, the positive contribution of migrant domestic workers.
Thanks, Debbie. And I would ask Betty the same question on like the proposal that Maya is doing with the state responsibility in employer-employee relationship. Can you imagine something like that? I mean, you said before that the state is absent also, but could you think that would be a proposal that people organize behind?
Yes, thank you so much for that, for the question. Yes, I agree that in our, sorry, the background is a bit dark. There's a little cut in electricity, which is very common here. But at least you can hear my voice. So I believe
we can
that
see you fine.
Yes, thank you. I think that we need to push for a legislation, a specific legislation for the recognition, the rights of domestic workers, and an end to stigma and discrimination, and to ensure that it's passed and is implemented. Now we have all kinds of legislations in Nigeria. We have the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act of 2015, which to some extent stipulates areas of violence against women. But I'm not aware of any specific legislation that really focuses on the rights, the recognition, and the respect of domestic workers, and which pushes also for an end to the discrimination, the stigma that they face, and the widespread abuse. So I think that it would be really good if we have that kind of legislation. And in Nigeria, one of the things that has really worked for us is that there's a groundswell of activism, human rights activists actively engaging the states and each stakeholders. And I believe it's something that can push through if we really make concerted efforts. And also we need a lot of sensitization, a lot of consciousness building to be able to do that. I think it was Maya that mentioned that a part of the problem is getting the buy-in of even feminist women's rights activists. For instance, one of our programs in recent years is about menstrual hygiene management for women, and they push for government to make free distribution of sanitary pads a policy for women, especially vulnerable women and especially schoolgirls. And many gender activists do not buy into it. They feel very squeamish when we talk about it. But this is a reality. Period poverty is extremely widespread in the country, but not many female feminists buy into the idea for an advocacy built again around period poverty. So we have to even sensitize women's rights activists, feminists to have a buy-in, so that we push for the for this kind of legislation. And I believe that it's possible. And also, I think Deborah mentioned the media. In Nigeria, the social media is extremely influential. Just recently, the president felt overwhelmed and then he banned Twitter. I'm sure some of you are aware of that because It's a platform for questioning the misgovernance that we have at hand and for exposing corruption and all sorts of things. And so the social media also can be utilized to push for the rights and the respect, the dignity of domestic workers. And also, we have to, as part of that, is also to ensure that we build a movement that, domestic workers also build their own movement, and they have, and they become part of the organized labor. It may be a little step, it may not be easy at first, but with time, I think, because it's become a global reality, it's a global movement, and we cannot be left aside. And especially because we are having issues, we are having major issues. There's a lot of dehumanization going on, a lot of trampling of the rights of domestic workers. And so we have a major case to make that there have to be legislation to check this and to ensure that people who abuse the rights of their employers, the domestic workers, are brought to book. And I think that this, I believe that is something that is achievable. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Betty. Maya, you just wanted to react very shortly?
Yes, 3 quick points. My colleagues in the movement have mentioned, the issues of migrant domestic workers and the need for, concerted legislation. I just want to add to this point and say, again, the kind of theoretical framework and the kind of demand which I have placed before all of you today, which is the need for a tripartite structure of, relations in this industry and putting the state back into this domain of work. I think those nodal registration offices, those employment exchange offices will actually benefit migrant domestic workers even more. Because in my country, for example, a majority of domestic workers are actually migrants that are migrating internally within the country, not just externally to other, parts of the world. And so precisely coming from these vulnerable, impoverished backgrounds, these migrant workers, if they can register with these nodal state agencies, it provides them much greater protection, empowers them much more in the workplace. The second point I want to quickly make, my colleagues and many others I've heard, even in today's program, talk about the need to usher in concerted legislation. I'm appealing to everyone again. It's not just about bringing in another piece of good law or good legislation. It is about the nature of this work. The nature of this work is very peculiar, has its specificities, which is one reason why domestic workers are so oppressed, hyper-exploited. So what are we doing to actually change the very nature of the work itself? And here, I feel there is need for an international consensus. The transnational community of activists need to recognize this, that we need a different theoretical framework, one that focuses and centralizes the demand to change the nature of the work itself and not just be happy with some legislation, good or bad. The last point I'd like to make here, the COVID-19 situation in my country, in South Asia, of course, brought a lot of havoc with it. And it exposed very clearly the fact that, the temporary solution that upper class households, women of upper class households had figured out to resolve their domestic work, responsibilities by subletting it to domestic worker, that interim solution fell flat. Because during lockdowns imposed during COVID-19, domestic workers were not allowed into residential complexes. And then a lot of women from, upper class households had to then go back to the kitchen and be burdened by that work, along with, paid work outside, home work from home kind of, situations. And therefore, I would say the goal of the larger socialization of this work, the kind of visions which Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, so many other ideologues of the progressive women's movement have laid out before us, they need to come back. And we need to fight for that long-term goal of socialization, which actually will provide relief to even upper-class households, upper-class women. I think the solution that they've come up with, hiring a cheaply available domestic worker, is not a solution. And we need to realize that contradiction in a major way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you already included again what I wanted to ask you all for a closing round, as we are already 15 minutes late, but it was very, very interesting to talk to you all. But I wanted to give Betty and Debbie also the possibility to have some closing remarks. You all mentioned already something on an international consensus or a global campaign. Deborah was already imagining. So, but there are some organizations on a regional level or also on international level. So, what in your from your perspective is missing in an international connection of the fights, also to pressure more on the governments or the unions or other social movements? Betty, do you want to start?
I think Deborah can start.
Okay, Deborah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's very important to to create a transnational alliance. I would just want to share our experience. We have created a network of transnational domestic workers in Europe, and it's called Respect Network. It stands for Rights, Equality, Solidarity, Power, Europe, Cooperation Today. And we were able to work together in in influencing the drafting of the ILO convention in 1990s, and we organized side events in ILO to work with other migrant domestic organizations to push forward our demands to be to be included in the drafting of the convention. So with the concerted effort of transnational migrant organizations, I think something can be done, and something could produce results favorably for the migrant domestic workers. So it's just that with this, pandemic, and with the limited resources everywhere, it has become difficult for us to really get together. Although online meeting is important, but then it's still important to have an in-person meeting to share the good practice, and to show the good practice that each migrant domestic workers association are doing in their respective countries.
Thanks, Betty. I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's basically to echo what Deborah has said, that there is a major need for, and also that Maya has said, there's a need for a global alliance to push more for the rights of domestic workers. And I believe that with that, more and more countries will sign the ILO 189, and there'll be a major consciousness across most countries of the world as to the rights of domestic workers. And countries like ours, which have basically no organized where domestic workers are not part of the organized labor, we can catch up quickly. Of course, I've been speaking in general terms because I've not been very familiar with the issue of domestic workers, movements about the rights and unionism around domestic workers' rights, because we do not have that in Nigeria. But I'm extremely familiar with the dehumanized conditions, with the very bad condition of the working class, and with domestic workers, even at the lower rung of the ladder. They're fighting discrimination, you're fighting economic oppression, you're fighting the abuse of their human rights. Many of them are fighting sexual abuse. And so I believe that we can learn a lot, first from a regional alliance, and then a global alliance. And it will go a long way because the rights of every domestic worker every domestic worker has a right, just like every other worker under the planet. And I believe that this will go a very long way if we have a concerted global movement, as Maya would say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Betty. And I give the last word one more time to Maya, just some closing remarks as well. So
I just wanted to share with all activists who are watching this program and others that ratification of Convention 189 is important. But now, of course, the fundamental point is that we need to move from the mere issue of parity of domestic workers with other workers. Now we need an international consensus, and we need more theoretical reflections that emphasize that we cannot, think just in terms of or simply channelize our energy towards one more piece of law coming into force, which we know will be difficult to implement given the larger, jurisprudential shifts in many countries where the state is withdrawing from the regulation of work relations. We therefore need, at this juncture, to work concertedly towards the change in the nature of this work, its highly privatized, individualized form. And we can do this if we build forces together, we build a consensus in which we're forcing the state to mediate this work relationship on a day-to-day basis. I think on this question of transformation of the work process itself, there is much need for transnational mobilization and a consensus. I hope that this will come through soon. Thank you.
I hope it will come through soon as well. And I thank you very, very much. I can't thank you enough for this very inspiring exchange. I still learned a lot, although I read a lot about the topic. So thanks for being here. I hope we keep working together, and the foundation is obviously following up on this. So have a nice evening or day, wherever you are, have it, stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Yeah, bye.